Good morning again. We're going to do this passage. It's in Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 56. Don't worry. We should be able to get through them at least by 1:30. We're on page 732 in your Pew Bible. And there's an event that's taking place in here. And some of the description of it I recognize is a little bit difficult as a Westerner to understand. So I've asked Russ to help me out here. And we're going to, if you come over here, we're going to kind of give you a little bit of a display of what happens in American culture when we sit to talk to each other. And then we're going to change it. I believe we've lived in some Mediterranean cultures and some Eastern cultures between the two of us. To give you an idea of how close this can get. All right? This is more American culture. I want to be able to see him and talk to him. How's your day been?
Good.
Yeah? Are you comfortable at this distance?
Sure.
Now, if I want to be a little bit closer to you, you still comfortable? Are you sure? Now see, I really think we really need to have this conversation. No, come on, don't go anywhere. All right, thank you very much. We laugh, but the truth is, when I first went and lived in China, we'd sit in these chairs like this, and people would sit so close to me, men, they would actually place their hand on my leg. Yeah. It made me a little bit uncomfortable. You know, the old, you see people in movies and stuff, you're trying to get the guy's arm off you. I'm trying to get the guy's arm off my leg. Please, don't touch me. And then I would sit with my hands on my knees so that you couldn't put your hand back on my leg. And by the second year, I was a little more comfortable with it, but whew, those first couple of years, the first couple of months, sorry, not years, that was really difficult. But something's going on in this passage, and this is why we illustrate this. Let's read this passage. We're in chapter 8. It says, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Okay, welcomed him from where? When did he return from? If you remember, when Ron was preaching, he was talking about, he had gone over to the area of the Gerasenes, and he was on his way back. And when he's on his way back, the people are waiting for him. So he's come home, he's come back across the lake, and everybody knows he's coming. The lake's only 7 miles wide. It's not that difficult to figure out when a boat's coming across it. Not that many boats probably coming just across. Most of the boats out there are fishing boats. And a significant thing is going to happen here as we go through this, because really we get two stories in one in this passage. The first story relates to Jairus and his daughter, and halfway through it there's an interlude. A whole different conversation. And that's what's going on with this. I said, why in the world are there two stories here mixed into each other? Part of it's because they interrelate and they happen concurrently. And a lot of what's going on here, we're going to see, is that faith is being talked about. How's it displayed? What's going on? If you remember from when Ron was talking, that guy wanted to follow Jesus wherever he went. And he was told, no, go back and tell what the Lord has done for you. He was excited. His faith was on display. Everybody gets to see it. But that's not quite what happens in this story, at least at the beginning or the middle of it. The first part of it here, everybody's expecting him. There's a large crowd, and a ruler named Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. Now, a number of things are going on here that make this hard to understand. Ruler of the synagogue wasn't like a pastor or a preacher. This was the guy who was actually responsible for the order of worship every day or every Saturday. He set up the songs. He set up how things were going to go. And then he says, hey, can you read the passage for us? Can you tell us a few words about this passage? We're going to have somebody come in from another town to talk about it. That's who the ruler of the synagogue was. And in a small town, this guy would be pretty important. The next part of this that's significant is he falls at Jesus' feet. If we go back to Luke chapter 7, and you see that in your notes there, remember Simon the Pharisee? He didn't bother getting water for Jesus to wash his feet. He didn't give him any perfume to anoint his head with oil or anything. Just sort of invited him in and was like, okay. This is the opposite response. That response was one kind of I'm higher than you, I'm better than you, I'm more important than you. Jairus is going, look, I'm all in. See, in our culture, some of you are old enough to remember, hey, women don't show their ankles in public, right? And my daughter went to watch a movie where somebody comments in it, I saw her ankles. In this culture, a man of high position didn't show his ankles. That's why when you get to the story of the prodigal son, the fact that the father hikes up his robe and runs is so significant. You don't run, you don't hike up your robe because somebody might see your ankles. So here we have the ruler of the synagogue putting himself face down in front of Jesus. This guy is all in. Well, why? Of course he's all in. It's his daughter. It's his only daughter. She's only 12. But it's significant even in that because as a daughter she would place second-rate culturally. And he's still all in. This is a loving father. This is a caring father. This is somebody who's all in. His faith is on display. He puts himself at his feet, pleads with Jesus to come, begs of him. You understand that difference there? It's not just, hey, if you got a little bit of time, you can come over and take care of my daughter. You just walk up to him face to face. He's all in. He's treating Jesus as a strong authority figure, a strong person of position, instead of him being the one of the highest position in the community. Then as he is on his way, as Jesus goes on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. That's the significance of what we were doing up here a few minutes ago. How close can we get? If I try and walk through a crowd here in the States, even if there's a whole bunch of people, say we're going to a football game, one of Jared's games, right? We're going to a game. When I walk through the crowd, I'm still doing my best not to touch anybody, right? I don't want anybody making contact with me because that's a little bit unusual. I don't like that. Please don't touch me. I have to have my space. And it may be a little bit smaller space than normal, but I'm still trying not to touch anybody. But this here says the people were so close, they almost crushed him. People want to see Jesus. They want to see what he's done. They may have heard of him casting the demons out across the river, across the lake already. They've certainly heard of him raising the dead and all the other things that he's done. They want to see him, and they want to be close to him. They want to have a little piece of that action. They want to touch him. And then there was a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. If you flip over to the Mark passage, Mark chapter 5, Mark 5, verses 25 and 26, it's on page 710 in your Pew Bible. It says, she had spent all of her money trying to get well over the last 12 years. On doctors. And not only had they not helped her, they made her worse. That's what the Mark passage says. They made her worse. So we have this here. She's got no hope. We don't think a whole lot of this other than, man, she was really sick. But I want to go back to page 82 in your pew Bibles, Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 and following, because there's some significant stuff going on here that you're about to see. In Leviticus, it says, when a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean. And then if you keep going, it says, anything she lays on is unclean, anything she sits on is unclean, whoever touches it must wash their clothes, and he will be unclean until evening. And if you go into the following verses, in verse 25 it says, when a woman has discharge of blood for many days at any other time than a period, or a discharge that extends beyond her period, she will be unclean for as long as there is discharge. And if you keep going, you find out that the rules for touching her are the same as when she's on her period. This woman has been unclean for 12 years under Mosaic law. For 12 years, if somebody touches her, they're also unclean. They can't go to worship. They can't go to synagogue. They can't go to the temple. They can't do these other things. They have to purify themselves and wait until evening to be clean again. This woman may have hardly been touched by anybody for 12 years. She's at the bottom of society. Remember we talked a few weeks ago about this old Jewish prayer that was, thank you, God, that I'm not a Gentile and I'm not a woman. Okay, this is that next step. I'm not a Gentile, I'm not a woman, and I haven't been unclean for 12 years. This is who this woman is. This is what she's been dealing with and going through. She's been rejected for that amount of time. And she comes up behind him, verse 44, she came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She's trying to not be noticed. She may be trying to protect Jesus so that he doesn't know he's unclean, because her contact makes him unclean. And traditionally they would wear a cloak. A religious Jewish man would wear a cloak. It would have some tassels at the end, prayer tassels. It may have even been that she touched, trying not to make direct contact with him so he could feel it. It's fascinating to me because it says, and immediately she stopped, or her bleeding stopped. It didn't take a while. It's not until after what happens next that her bleeding stopped. And sometimes when I've heard this taught, that's how I've heard it taught. Oh wait, this is after Jesus talks to her. Because what happens next is he says, who touched me? Jesus stops him. Who touched me? Jesus asked. This, you're going on your trip, you got all the kids back before we had to have seatbelts on everybody. There's 5 kids sitting in the back seat. Mom, he's touching me. Anybody hear that? Right? He's touching me. He's touching me. Don't let him touch me. Jesus turns around and goes, who touched me? And everybody denied it. Peter actually goes, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. He's basically going, everybody's touching you. And you want to know who touched you? You look at this crowd here. You see all of these people? Every single one of them has touched you. What are you asking? What are you talking about? Everybody's touching you. Remember that crowd? If you ever go to a crowd, you go to, here we say football. Actually, overseas we'd say football as well, but we call it soccer here. You go to a soccer match, you try and get in, and people are pressed up against each other, fighting for space, trying to get in. This is the kind of thing that's going on with Jesus. And he's going, who touched me? But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know the power has gone out from me. He's going, there's somebody who specifically touched me, not just to be able to say, oh man, I shook hands with the president. I got to touch Colin Powell. I met Rihanna or whoever. That's not what's going on. He said, somebody specifically touched me and reached out to me in faith for something to happen. Who touched me? And then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. And she told him everything that had happened and how she touched him. She told why she had touched him and how she had instantly been healed. You notice, again, she was already healed. And he's asking this question. It's already healed. Why is he making a big deal out of this? She's already healed. What's the big deal? And then he turns to her and he goes, daughter. You know, interesting, as I was reading through all the commentaries, they say this is the only time in the Bible that Jesus uses this expression for somebody. He's making a big deal out of this. Everybody here is now watching you because you tried to be as quiet as you can and I drew attention to you. Now I'm going to address you with the closest form of address that he will use in all the scriptures. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. And the only thing I could come to as I looked through it is there's one reason for it. There's one reason Jesus does this. And here's what it is. Your faith has to be public. How many times have you heard somebody say, oh, I believe in Jesus, but this is just between me and God. I don't like to talk about it or share it. I don't want people to know this. I don't want them to view me differently. This is just between me and God. How many times have you heard that? I hear it frequently. And yet Jesus is going, look, you came up and touched me. You had enough faith to come up and touch me. You were healed instantly. My conversation with you is not what's healing you. Your faith healed you. But you got to admit it. I need you to publicly acknowledge your faith. What's the scripture say? If you believe, if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart God raised you from the dead, you will be saved. I'm looking for that public acknowledgement of your faith. That's all Jesus is doing. That's why as soon as she says it, we go from, who is this? To, daughter, go. Your faith has made you well. Now the interesting thing to me in all of this is Jairus. Jairus is probably standing there, and there may be some spiritual significance to the fact that his daughter is 12 years old and this woman has been suffering for 12 years. And I'm sure in Jairus' mind, because he's the ruler of the synagogue, he's the one who she needs to go to when she becomes clean again. The fact that they're both 12 years. And he's probably going, why are we stopping here? What are we waiting for? What are we doing? She's been bleeding for 12 years. A couple more hours isn't going to affect anything. We can deal with this later. My daughter is dying. She's not unclean. She's not at the bottom of the food chain. She's my daughter. I'm as high up the food chain as things get. He's got to be thinking these things. And Jesus takes this time to pause and wait. And take care of the situation that's happening. I find it interesting because the next time Jesus raises someone from the dead, Lazarus, he also pauses for 2 days. And when he gets to the house, people go, well, if you'd come here earlier, he'd have been okay. And this almost happens here as well. You don't hear it, but you almost see it. Because while Jesus is still speaking, verse 49, someone comes from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. We know this is a guy because it says he said it. So while all of this is going on, the interlude takes enough time that Jairus' daughter dies. And people go, oh well. He could have made her well. He could have healed her. But now she's dead. This is done. And hearing this, Jesus turns to Jairus and says, don't be afraid, just believe. We're back on that conversation of faith, right? Jairus had enough faith to throw himself at his feet when she was sick. Now he's being asked to have enough faith. Trust me, I got this. He says, and she will be healed. That relates back to John 14:6. I am the resurrection. No, that's John 11. I'm sorry. John 14:6 is, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. The John 11 passage is where Jesus is talking to Martha. He says, look, I am the resurrection and the life. And he is. And that's what's going on here. They walk in. He arrives at the house of Jairus, and he didn't let anyone go in with him except for Peter and John and James. It's interesting, Jesus keeps using these three. If we get to Matthew 17:1, when Jesus is going up for the transfiguration, there are three people Jesus takes with him. Peter, James, and John. This is the inner circle. This is the close part. He chooses these three and Jairus and his wife. It says all these people around are mourning. Verse 52. Meanwhile, all the people are wailing and mourning for her. Jesus says, stop wailing. She's not dead, but asleep. It was fairly common at a Jewish funeral to have hired mourners. Make sure that we're mourning effectively. Crying loudly enough. I'm going to assume that that's what these people are, mostly because in verse 53, when Jesus says something, they laugh at him. If they're really in mourning, how are they all of a sudden going to start laughing? As soon as he says, stop wailing, she's not dead but asleep, they laugh at him, knowing she was dead. Look, this may have been 2,000 years ago, but they could still take a pulse and had an idea of when somebody had stopped breathing. They had a pretty good idea. This person is dead, they're gone, they're not here anymore. She was only 12 years old. You stopped and you dealt with that other woman. You could have helped this. And they laughed at him. But Jesus takes her by the hand and said, child, get up. I think it's fascinating and it's interesting because when you look at it, there are a few other times in the scriptures where someone is raised from the dead. But it takes effort. Remember last week when we talked about talking to the storm and Jesus is just like, hush, be quiet. And that's all it takes for him when Jonah had to be thrown into the ocean. The same thing is going on here. If you flip over to 1 Kings 17, verse 21, page 253, when Elijah wants to raise a boy from the dead, he throws himself onto the boy 3 times and calls out to God, please raise this young man from the dead. And in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 34, page 262 in your Pew Bible, Elisha lays himself on the boy's body. Again, I believe it's 3 times in order to raise this young man from the dead. He's having to call out. And then there's Jesus. Because I am the way, the truth, and the life. The life says, come on, child, get up. And it says her spirit returned to her, and at once she stood up. And Jesus told them to give her something to eat. It's interesting because on the command, she gets up. Her spirit comes back to her. Sometimes people say, well, when Jesus says she's asleep, she was just sleeping. People mistook it. Well, her spirit wouldn't have left her if she was just asleep. This girl was dead. And Jesus goes, get up. Why? Because the power that Elisha and Elijah were having to call on was standing here. He doesn't have to call out or make a big deal out of any of it. Just get up. Come on. The significance also is that they give her something to eat. If you remember back to the very earliest part when we started talking about some of Jesus' miracles, when Peter's mother, her mother-in-law, is healed, it says that she immediately got up and started to serve them food. When Jesus heals somebody, when you're sick, when you're so sick that you just died, if a doctor helps you to get better, you're still going to spend 3 weeks in the hospital, right? When Jesus heals you, he says, okay, give her some food. She's ready for it right now. This is no liquid diet. This is no soft food diet. This is, let's eat. Because when he heals her, they are healed back to the original condition. Then he goes on and he says something, and it says her parents are astonished, you think? We know this girl is dead. She's very dead. Everybody's freaking out about it. And all of a sudden she gets up and starts eating because this guy, much less effort than King says it took the great prophets to do, raises her from the dead. Yeah, they're astonished. And then he turns to him and he says something. Don't tell anybody what happened. I'm going to go out on a limb that they told everybody anyway. But why the difference? Why does he make the one woman speak and then tell these people, don't say anything? I'm going to suggest that there's a couple of things, and it may relate to why Jesus used the euphemism asleep, in that this is still early in Jesus' ministry. This is the first year of his ministry. We're trying to cut down a little bit on the notoriety. We don't want crowds crushing us every time we get off a boat. We don't need to make this a bigger deal than it is. But the other thing is, unlike that woman, Jairus' faith was already on display. Remember, Jairus comes up to him, throws himself on his feet, at his feet, and says, please, come heal my daughter. I know you can do it. That's a whole lot different approach than I'm going to sneak up from behind you and just touch the hemline. The faith is already on display. And when the child dies, Jesus goes, just believe. And Jairus, apparently, because he continues to take Jesus to his house, does that. See, Jairus' faith is already on display for people. He doesn't have to be called out. Come on, I need you to say, I believe. He's already done it. He's already showed that faith. So we go into this. Why did Jesus make them wait for the woman and then wait for the child to die? I think it's faith. He's demonstrating to them with this woman, this is no magic trick. This isn't just touch my robe. This is faith that saved her. This is the power of God. This is God. And when he comes to Jairus' home, he demonstrates that he is the resurrection and the life. They had to have faith too. Not just in a magic trick, not just in his ability to heal, but in his power over life and death. But what does this mean to me? What does this mean for us? And it comes to this, as near as I can tell, it's all about faith. Is your faith visible? We go through life, we don't want to have to share it, we don't really have to talk to our neighbors about the fact that, I'm a Christian. That's why I do things differently. That's why instead of watching the game Sunday morning, I go to church. That's why there's certain things I don't agree with. There's certain ways that I handle life. It's because I'm a Christian. And you hear people, well, I'm a Christian, but it's just between me and God. And he's going, nah, I don't think so. It says this woman had been bleeding for 12 years, and she's trying to remain anonymous. She quietly touches Jesus in the crowd, and doesn't even touch him from the front, but from behind. She doesn't touch his hand, or his feet even. She's touching his cloak to make sure she goes unnoticed. And she tries to remain invisible and anonymous. She has the faith to be healed, but she doesn't want to be noticed. Jesus won't let that happen. Faith has to be visible. It has to be seen. It needs to be heard. Remember we referenced that passage out of Romans? If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead. He won't let her disappear into the crowd. He calls her out so that she can express what the Lord has done for her. Our faith needs to be that way. It needs to be visible. James says, you say you have faith and I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds. I will show you my faith by my deeds. Faith needs to be visible. That's one. The other one is, do you ever struggle with patience and God's timing? I mean, when I ask God to do something for me, when I ask him to fix a situation, to provide something for me, my real preference is that it happened yesterday. Right? I do that all the time. And I'm sure that's how Jairus felt. He'd come to Jesus, made a whole lot of people probably angry because the people in his congregation who were following the Pharisees and starting to dislike Jesus probably are pretty upset with him now for his recognition of who Jesus is. He prostrates himself in front of Jesus, begs Jesus to come to his home. Jesus says yes. He starts to walk with him. And then he stops to have a conversation with an unclean woman who's been unclean for 12 years. It's not an emergency. And in the middle of it, his daughter dies. I'm sure the patience for his timing is a little bit off right now. You know, if he'd done this when I asked him to, it'd be okay. My daughter would be fine. But God has a plan. You know Isaiah 40:31? They that wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings as eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. There's a plan here. And Jesus in John chapter 9, verses 1 to 3, page 758, his disciples come to him and they say, who sinned that this man was born blind? And Jesus goes, nobody. That happened that the power of God might be displayed. See, God has a plan. And sometimes, like Jairus, we've got to wait. We've got to wait for God to act, because God is acting for his glory, that his power can be displayed. So the question really is, do we have the patience to wait for God's timing? I mean, Jairus could have just thrown it in at this point and been like, forget it. You messed this up. I'm out of here without you. Or do we wait on the Lord, like Jairus did? So those are the things. How's our faith? Is it showing? And are we willing to wait for God for his timing?